I watched in complete disbelief as the massive helicopter hovered over my neighborhood, its rotors creating a deafening thunderstorm of sound and fury. Below, Karen stood on her perfectly manicured lawn, screaming at the top of her lungs, but her voice was completely swallowed by the mechanical roar above us. The thick steel cables were already attached. The garage was beginning to lift off its foundation, creaking and groaning against gravity itself. And trapped inside that garage, like a metal tomb, sat Karen's pristine white BMW. Her face had gone from smug satisfaction to pure horror in a matter of minutes. She was running around in circles, waving her arms frantically, trying to stop what could not be stopped. The same woman who had put an illegal padlock on my garage door just 72 hours earlier was now watching her precious car disappear into the sky. That was the moment I realized that sometimes the only way to beat a bully is to think bigger than they ever could. My name is David, and for 8 years I lived in Meadowbrook Estates without a single problem. I followed every HOA rule to the letter, kept my grass exactly 2¾ inches tall, and painted my shutters in only approved colors. I was the model homeowner that every community association dreams about. My garage was my sanctuary. Every morning at 6:30 I would open that door, fire up my work truck, and head out to my construction job. Every evening I would return home, park my truck inside, and spend an hour organizing my tools. That garage was not just storage space. It was my connection to everything that mattered in my life. Then Margaret Thompson moved in next door. Everyone called her Karen behind her back, though her real name was Margaret. She was in her mid-50s, with short blonde hair that looked like it was carved from plastic, and she wore the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Within 3 months of moving in, she had somehow gotten herself elected as the new HOA board president. Karen had a problem with everything. She measured grass with a ruler. She carried around a digital camera to document what she called violations. She would walk through the neighborhood every single morning, looking for something, anything, that was out of place. But Karen had a special problem with me. It started over something completely ridiculous. My mailbox was apparently 3 inches too far from the curb, according to some obscure regulation buried deep in the HOA bylaws. When I politely explained that my mailbox had been in the exact same position for 8 years without complaint, Karen's face turned red with anger. "The rules are the rules," she said, pointing her manicured finger at my chest, "and I intend to enforce every single one of them." From that moment on, I became her primary target. She would find problems that did not exist. She claimed my truck was too large for residential parking, even though the bylaws clearly allowed work vehicles. She said my tool shed was the wrong color, despite being the exact same beige as every other shed in the neighborhood. Every week brought a new violation notice, each one more ridiculous than the last. Then came that Tuesday morning in October. I woke up at my usual time, grabbed my coffee, and headed out to the garage for another day of work. But when I pressed the garage door opener, nothing happened. I pressed it again. Still nothing. I walked around to the front of the garage, and that was when I saw it. A massive industrial padlock had been installed on my garage door. Not just any padlock, but the kind they use on shipping containers and bank vaults. The kind that would require power tools to remove. Taped to the garage door was a notice printed on official HOA letterhead. It claimed that my garage was in violation of multiple community standards and was therefore being secured pending a formal hearing. The notice was signed by Margaret Thompson, HOA board president. I stood there in my driveway, staring at that padlock, and felt something inside me break. This woman had just locked me out of my own property. She had trapped my work truck, my tools, and everything I needed to make a living behind a door I could no longer open. But what Corinne did not know, what she could never have imagined, was that her own car was parked inside my garage at that very moment. I marched straight to Corinne's front door and rang the bell with enough force to wake the dead. She answered with that same plastic smile, as if nothing had happened. "Good morning, David," she said sweetly. "Is there something I can help you with?" "You put a lock on my garage," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I need you to remove it immediately." Corinne pulled out a manila folder that looked like it had been prepared in advance. Inside were printed copies of HOA regulations, photographs of my property taken from various angles, and a list of alleged violations that read like a legal document. "Your garage door has been painted an unauthorized color," she began, reading from her notes. "The hinges are showing rust stains that constitute a maintenance violation. Your work truck has been parked inside for more than the allowable 72 consecutive hours as outlined in Section 12.4 of the Residential Vehicle Policy." I stared at her in complete amazement. "Corinne, my garage door is white, the same white as every other garage door in this neighborhood, and there is no 72-hour parking limit for vehicles stored inside private garages." She flipped through her folder and produced a photograph that supposedly showed rust stains on my hinges. The photo was so close up and poorly lit that it could have been taken anywhere. "The evidence is clear," she said with satisfaction. "The lock will remain until you address these violations and pay the associated fines." "What fines?" I asked. $200 per violation, plus a $50 administrative fee," she replied. "And of course, there will be additional daily storage fees until the matter is resolved." I realized at that moment that I was dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with reality. Corinne had created her own legal system where she was judge, jury, and executioner. She had convinced herself that she had the authority to lock people out of their own property. "Corinne," I said slowly, "you do realize that your car is parked inside my garage right now?" For the first time, her confident expression flickered. "What are you talking about?" "Yesterday evening, you asked if you could park in my garage while your driveway was being power washed. Your white BMW is sitting right next to my work truck, behind the door you just locked." The color drained from Corinne's face. She had not thought this through. In her eagerness to punish me, she had trapped her own vehicle. "Well," she stammered, "you will just have to address the violations before either vehicle can be removed." I left Corinne's house and immediately called the local police. The dispatcher was polite but firm. "This sounds like a civil matter between neighbors," she explained. "You will need to resolve it through your HOA or take it up in court." I called the county sheriff. Same response. I called the city code enforcement office. They told me that HOA disputes were outside their jurisdiction. For the next 2 days, I researched everything I could find about HOA regulations, property law, and tenant rights. I discovered that Corinne had acted completely outside her authority. The HOA board had never voted on my supposed violations. She had no legal right to install a lock on my property. But the more I researched, the more I realized that proving this in court would take months and cost thousands of dollars in legal fees. Meanwhile, Corinne continued her reign of terror throughout the neighborhood. I learned that Mrs. Rodriguez had been fined for having the wrong color flowers in her garden. The Johnson family was being threatened with a lien because their fence was allegedly 2 inches too tall. Old Mr. Peterson had received a violation notice because his wheelchair ramp was considered an unauthorized modification to his front steps. Karen had turned our peaceful community into a police state, and she was using her position as HOA president to settle personal grudges and assert control over everyone around her. But Karen had made one critical mistake. She had locked her own car inside the property she was trying to control, and that mistake was about to cost her everything. As I sat in my kitchen that Thursday evening, staring at the industrial padlock that was keeping me from my own garage, an idea began to form in my mind. It was crazy. It was unprecedented. It was probably the most audacious thing I had ever considered. But it might just work. Friday morning brought a new level of harassment from Karen. I found 3 more violation notices taped to my front door, each one more ridiculous than the last. According to Karen, my mailbox flag was pointing in the wrong direction. My house numbers were not the approved font style, and my garden hose was visible from the street in violation of community aesthetic standards. But the final notice was the one that pushed me over the edge. Karen was now claiming that my locked garage constituted an abandoned structure, and she was initiating proceedings to have it condemned and demolished. She gave me 14 days to resolve all violations and pay accumulated fines, or the HOA would take action to remove what she called a neighborhood eyesore. The total amount she was demanding had grown to over $3,000. I called an emergency meeting with the other HOA board members, but discovered that Karen had been operating completely on her own. Tom Bradley, who served as treasurer, was appalled when I showed him the violation notices. "Margaret never brought any of this to the board," he said, shaking his head. "She has no authority to lock your garage or impose these fines, but getting her removed from the board would require a formal vote, and that takes time." "How much time?" I asked. "At least 60 days, maybe longer if she fights it." 60 days. I could not go 60 days without access to my tools and work truck. I would lose my job, fall behind on my mortgage, and probably lose my house. Karen knew this. She was counting on it. That afternoon, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was Karen, and she was furious. "You need to get my car out of your garage immediately," she demanded. "I would love to," I replied calmly, "but there seems to be a padlock preventing me from opening the door." "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I need my car for a doctor's appointment tomorrow morning." "Then I suggest you remove the lock you installed." There was a long pause. "I am not removing anything until you pay the fines and address the violations." "Karen," I said slowly, "you have trapped your own car. You created this situation. You can end it any time you want." "I will not be manipulated," she replied. "You will follow the proper procedures, or your garage will be demolished with both vehicles inside." She hung up the phone, but I could hear the panic in her voice. Karen was starting to realize that her power play had backfired spectacularly. Over the weekend, I watched from my kitchen window as Karen paced around my garage like a caged animal. She tried pulling on the padlock. She attempted to pry open the side door. She even brought over a ladder and tried to access the garage through the small window near the roof. Nothing worked. The industrial lock she had installed was too strong, and the garage was too secure. Her precious BMW was trapped as effectively as my work truck. Sunday evening, Karen knocked on my door with a completely different attitude. The arrogant HOA president was gone, replaced by a desperate woman who needed her car back. "David," she said, trying to sound reasonable, "perhaps we can work out some kind of arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" I asked. "Maybe we could temporarily remove the lock, just long enough for me to get my car out. Then we can reinstall it while we work through the violation process. I pretended to consider this proposal. So you want me to help you retrieve your car from my illegally locked garage, and then allow you to lock me out again? Well, when you put it like that, she began. Karen, you have two choices. Remove the lock permanently and drop all the fake violations, or leave things exactly as they are. Her face turned red with anger. You cannot hold my car hostage. I am not holding anything hostage, I replied. You locked the door. You have the only key. This entire situation is your creation. She stormed away, muttering threats about lawyers and lawsuits. That night, I made the phone call that would change everything. I contacted Davidson Heavy Lift, a helicopter service company that specialized in moving large structures. The conversation was surreal. You want us to airlift a garage? The dispatcher asked. That is correct, I replied. A standard two-car residential garage, approximately 24 by 24 feet. Sir, that is definitely possible, but it is going to be expensive. And we will need permits, insurance documentation, and clear access for the helicopter. Cost is not an issue, I said. How soon can you do it? If you can handle the paperwork, we could have a crew there by Wednesday morning. I spent the next 3 days preparing for the most audacious act of revenge in HOA history. Monday morning, I began the most meticulous planning process of my entire life. If I was going to airlift my garage with Karen's car trapped inside, I needed to make sure every detail was legal, safe, and absolutely devastating to her authority. My first call was to the county building department. I explained that I needed to relocate a detached garage structure from my property and asked about the required permits and procedures. The clerk was surprisingly helpful. As long as the structure is being moved within the same county and you have proper insurance and professional contractors, it is just a matter of filing the right paperwork, she explained. You will need a building relocation permit, a temporary road closure permit if you are using the street, and proof of liability insurance. The permits cost $400 and took 2 days to process. I paid with a smile. Next, I contacted my homeowner's insurance company. I explained that I was planning to relocate my garage using a helicopter service and needed to verify my coverage for the operation. After being transferred to 3 different departments, I finally reached a supervisor who confirmed that my policy would cover any accidental damage, as long as I used licensed and insured contractors. Davidson Heavy Lift sent out a survey team Tuesday afternoon. 2 technicians spent 3 hours examining my garage, measuring dimensions, checking the structural integrity, and calculating the lifting points needed for a safe helicopter operation. This is definitely doable, the lead technician told me. The garage is well built and should handle the stress of being lifted. We will need to disconnect the electrical service and cap the water lines, but the structure itself is solid. What about the vehicles inside? I asked. They will be fine as long as they are properly secured. We have lifted buildings with cars inside before. The garage will act like a giant shipping container. The technician handed me an estimate that made my eyes water. The helicopter service, permits, insurance, and relocation costs would total nearly $15,000. But when I thought about Karen's smug face and her threats to demolish my garage, the price seemed reasonable. I called my bank and arranged for a cashier's check. Wednesday morning, I received another angry phone call from Karen. I know you are planning something, she said accusingly. Mrs. Peterson saw surveyors at your house yesterday. Just getting some work done, I replied casually. If you think you can intimidate me, you are wrong, she continued. I have already contacted my attorney about your refusal to cooperate with the HOA process. That is interesting, I said. What did your attorney say about you locking my garage without board approval? There was a long pause. My attorney says I was within my rights as HOA president. I seriously doubted that any attorney had told her such a thing, but I did not argue. Well, Karen, I hope your attorney also explained the legal consequences of restricting access to someone else's property without a court order. You cannot threaten me, she snapped. I am not threatening anyone, I replied. I am simply exercising my property rights. Speaking of which, how is your car situation working out? She hung up without answering. That afternoon, I had my final planning meeting with the Davidson heavy lift crew. We went over every detail of the operation, from the helicopter approach path to the landing zone where my garage would be relocated. We have done some unusual jobs, the crew chief told me, but this one is definitely going to be memorable. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Absolutely, I replied. What about the woman whose car is inside? Have you given her a chance to resolve this situation? I showed him copies of all the violation notices, the photographs of the illegal padlock, and the threatening letter about garage demolition. She created this situation, I explained. She has had multiple opportunities to end it. The crew chief nodded slowly. In that case, we will be here Friday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. Make sure the area is clear of bystanders and be prepared for a lot of attention. This kind of operation tends to draw a crowd. Thursday evening, I sat on my back deck with a beer, watching the sunset and thinking about what would happen the next morning. Karen's car had been trapped in my garage for 6 days. She had become increasingly desperate, making phone calls to city officials, the police, and anyone else who might help her regain access to her vehicle. But Karen had painted herself into a corner. She could not remove the lock without admitting that she had acted illegally. She could not acknowledge my property rights without undermining her authority as HOA president. And she could not get her car back without giving up the power she had worked so hard to accumulate. Tomorrow morning, I was going to solve all of her problems at once. I went to bed early, setting my alarm for 6:30. I wanted to be fully awake when Karen discovered that her world was about to be turned upside down. Friday morning arrived with crystal clear skies and perfect flying weather. I was awake before my alarm, too excited and nervous to sleep. At exactly 7 o'clock, I heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. I walked out to my front yard and watched as the massive aircraft appeared over the tree line. It was bigger than I had expected, a heavy-lift helicopter painted bright orange with Davidson Heavy Lift written in bold letters along the side. The rotor wash was so powerful that it bent the trees and sent debris flying across the entire neighborhood. Within minutes, people began emerging from their houses to see what was happening. Mrs. Rodriguez stood on her front porch with her mouth hanging open. The Johnson family gathered on their lawn, pointing up at the helicopter and talking excitedly among themselves. Old Mr. Peterson rolled his wheelchair out to the end of his driveway for a better view. But the most interesting reaction came from Karen's house. I watched as her front door flew open and she stumbled outside in her bathrobe and slippers, her hair sticking up in every direction. She looked up at the helicopter, then over at my garage, then back at the helicopter again. I could see the exact moment when she realized what was about to happen. Her face went through a progression of emotions that was almost comical. First confusion, then disbelief, then dawning horror, and finally pure panic. She ran across her perfectly manicured lawn, waving her arms and screaming at the helicopter pilot. Of course, there was no way he could hear her over the deafening roar of the rotors. The helicopter settled into a hover position directly over my garage, and I watched the crew begin their work. 4 technicians rappelled down from the aircraft, moving with military precision as they attached thick steel cables to predetermined lifting points on the garage structure. Karen was now running in circles around my driveway, still screaming incoherently. She tried to approach the work area, but one of the technicians politely but firmly directed her to maintain a safe distance. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, her voice barely audible over the mechanical thunderstorm above us. "This is illegal. This is vandalism. This is theft." I walked over to where she was standing and handed her a folder containing copies of all my permits, insurance documentation, and legal authorizations. "Everything is completely legal," I said, raising my voice to be heard. "I am relocating my garage to a storage facility across town." "My car is in there," she yelled. "Then you should have thought about that before you locked the door," I replied. The helicopter crew worked with incredible efficiency. Within 30 minutes, they had the garage completely rigged for lifting. The pilot increased power gradually, and I watched in amazement as my 2,000-pound garage structure began to rise off its foundation. The sound was indescribable. The helicopter engine screamed at maximum power, the garage creaked and groaned as it lifted into the air, and the rotor wash created a windstorm that flattened the grass and rattled every window in the neighborhood. Karen was now completely hysterical. She was running back and forth beneath the rising garage, jumping up and down, trying desperately to somehow stop what was happening. But there was nothing she could do. Her precious BMW was disappearing into the sky, trapped inside a garage that was no longer under her control. The entire neighborhood had gathered to watch the spectacle. I counted at least 30 people standing in yards and driveways, many of them taking photos and videos with their phones. Several news crews had arrived, having monitored the helicopter activity on emergency radio frequencies. As the garage reached its full lifting height of about 60 feet, I could see Karen's white BMW through the open side door, suspended in midair like a car in a giant flying shipping container. The sight was so surreal that I had to remind myself this was actually happening. The helicopter began moving slowly toward the street, carrying my garage and Karen's car away from Meadowbrook Estates. Karen followed on foot, running down the sidewalk and continuing to scream threats and demands that no one could hear. The procession moved at about 15 miles per hour, with the helicopter maintaining a steady altitude while police cars blocked traffic intersections along the route. I followed in my neighbor's truck, watching from the ground as my garage flew through the sky like something out of a science fiction movie. The entire operation took 45 minutes from takeoff to landing. The garage was gently deposited in a secure storage facility on the outskirts of town, where it would remain until Karen paid for the damage she had caused and formally apologized for her illegal actions. As I watched the helicopter crew disconnect their cables and prepare to depart, I realized that I had just executed the most spectacular act of revenge in HOA history. Karen had locked my garage to assert her authority, but instead she had handed me the perfect opportunity to destroy that authority completely. Her car was now my prisoner, and the entire world was watching. The media explosion was immediate and overwhelming. By Friday afternoon, videos of the garage airlift were trending on social media platforms across the country. The local news ran the story as their lead item, with reporters describing it as the most creative response to HOA overreach they had ever covered. My phone rang constantly with interview requests from television stations, newspapers, and online publications. The story had captured the public imagination in a way I never expected. People were calling me a hero, a genius, and an inspiration to anyone who had ever been bullied by petty authority figures. But the most satisfying reaction came from within my own neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on my door Friday evening with a plate of homemade cookies and tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Margaret has made my life miserable for months, seeing her running around screaming like that. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed." The Johnson family brought over a bottle of champagne. Old Mr. Peterson rolled his wheelchair down the street just to shake my hand and tell me that I had restored his faith in American ingenuity. Even Tom Bradley, the HOA treasurer, stopped by to congratulate me. "I have never seen anything like it," he said, grinning widely. "Margaret called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. I think she is going to demand that we take legal action against you." "Let her try," I replied. "Everything I did was completely legal." Meanwhile, Karen was discovering just how powerless she had become. She spent Friday afternoon calling every lawyer in town, trying to find someone who would help her get her car back. But the legal situation was crystal clear. I had legally relocated my garage using proper permits and professional contractors. Her car was trapped inside because she had illegally locked the door, not because of anything I had done. Saturday morning brought the emergency HOA board meeting that Tom had predicted. I was not invited, but Mrs. Rodriguez filled me in on the details afterward. Karen had demanded that the board authorize legal action against me for what she called destruction of property, theft, and creating a public nuisance. She wanted the HOA to sue me for the cost of retrieving her car and to impose additional fines for my failure to cooperate with the violation process. But the other board members had done their homework. They had reviewed the original complaints against me and discovered that Karen had acted completely outside her authority. She had never brought my supposed violations to the board for approval. She had installed the padlock without consulting anyone. She had imposed fines without following proper procedures. "Margaret," Tom Bradley had told her, "you created this entire situation by exceeding your authority as president. The board is not going to authorize any legal action because we would lose, and we would probably face a countersuit for harassment." Karen's response was to resign from the board effective immediately, claiming that her fellow members had betrayed her and failed to support proper enforcement of community standards. But her resignation did not solve her car problem. Saturday afternoon, I received a phone call from a man who identified himself as Karen's attorney. He was polite but firm in his demand that I return his client's vehicle immediately. "I understand your client's frustration," I told him, "but her car is trapped inside my garage because she illegally locked the door. I am happy to return her car as soon as she pays for the costs associated with relocating my garage." "What costs?" the lawyer asked. I provided him with a detailed breakdown. $15,000 for the helicopter service, $400 for permits, storage facility fees of $50 per day, and my time and inconvenience valued at $200 per day. The total amount came to over $16,000. "That is completely unreasonable," the lawyer protested. "Your client could have avoided all of these costs by not locking my garage in the first place," I replied. "She created this situation through her illegal actions. Now she needs to pay the consequences." "We could take this to court," he threatened. "Please do," I said. "I would love to have a judge review your client's decision to lock someone else's property without legal authority. I think the court would be very interested in her pattern of harassment and abuse of her HOA position." The lawyer said he would call me back, but I never heard from him again. Sunday evening, Karen appeared at my front door for the first time since the airlift. She looked terrible. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup was smeared, and she had the defeated expression of someone whose world had completely collapsed. "David," she said quietly, "we need to talk." Karen stood on my front porch looking like a completely different person from the arrogant HOA president who had locked my garage just 8 days earlier. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by the exhausted demeanor of someone who had finally realized the consequences of their actions. "I want my car back," she said simply. "I want my garage back," I replied. "But your illegal padlock is still preventing me from accessing my own property." She reached into her purse and pulled out a key ring. "I brought the key," she said, holding it out to me. "Just tell me what you want." I had prepared for this moment. "First, you will publicly apologize to me and every other homeowner you have harassed with fake violations. Second, you will reimburse me for all the costs associated with relocating my garage. Third, you will resign from any position of authority in this community and agree never to serve on the HOA board again." "How much money are we talking about?" she asked. $16,400, I said, "plus storage fees for each additional day your car remains in my garage." Karen's face went pale. "I do not have that kind of money." "Then you should have thought about that before you decided to play games with other people's property," I replied. We negotiated for another hour, but eventually reached an agreement. Karen would pay $8,000 immediately, followed by monthly payments of $500 until the balance was settled. She would write formal apology letters to every homeowner she had targeted, and she would deed restrictions on her own property that would prevent her from ever serving in any HOA leadership role. The key exchange happened the following Tuesday morning. Karen handed me the padlock key, and I drove to the storage facility to retrieve her BMW. She followed in a taxi, looking smaller and more defeated than I had ever seen her. When I opened the garage door and she saw her car for the first time in 10 days, Karen actually started crying. The BMW was fine, but the experience had broken something fundamental in her spirit. "I am sorry," she said as she got behind the wheel. "I never meant for things to go this far." "You meant every bit of it," I replied. "You just never expected anyone to fight back." 6 months later, Meadowbrook Estates had new HOA leadership and a completely different atmosphere. The ridiculous violation notices stopped. Neighbors began talking to each other again. Mrs. Rodriguez planted whatever flowers she wanted. The Johnson family raised their fence another 2 inches without asking permission. Karen still lives next door, but she keeps to herself now. She nods politely when we pass on the street, but we never speak. Her power is gone, her authority is destroyed, and everyone in the neighborhood knows exactly what happens when you try to bully the wrong person. As for me, I built a new garage in the exact same spot, painted it the exact same color, and installed the exact same door. But this time, I added a security system with cameras that record everything. Because you never know when someone might try to put a lock where it does not belong.